Happy Tuesday, guys. Guys, gals, and non-binary pals. Uh, so Foundations just dropped, and got a couple of brews here that I've been kind of working on before the release. So these are not play tested. I repeat, these are not play tested decks, but I think that there's something to them, and we'll see something probably come out of them. So it's always a fun place to kind of explore, right? And so this first one is Boros Burn, and we got a couple of really good burn options in Foundations. So we've got Bolt Wave, dealing 3 damage to each opponent for 1 red. It's kind of like the old Fire Bolt or Lightning Bolt. Anyway, Burst Lightning is just a strictly better shock. It does exactly what shock does, but also has the ability to have the kicker to deal 4 damage instead. Can also go face. We still have the shocks as well. And then we've got the lightning strikes. And Boros Charm deals 4 damage to target player or planeswalker, so that also giving you a lot of direct damage possibilities. And lightning helix for stabilization, that gives you life as well. And I kind of went back and forth on which way to take this. So one way that this could see this archetype going is by bringing in a bunch of prowess creatures like the Swift Spear and the Slick Shot Show Off, and kind of going for a little bit more of a creature-centric strategy with like the Lava Runner being a 2/2 haste as long as you've been casting your instances and sorceries. And I think that there's a lot of creature-targeted hate with mono black, and so I was kind of curious to just go with a creatureless list and see how it would run. And so we're kind of taking a little bit more of a control route with the temporary lockdowns and the sunfalls. And then I threw in the Pyromancer's Goggles as kind of a fun card to explore, being able to create red mana that then allows you to copy all of your burn spells for additional damage. So basically, your spells deal double damage. I think could be worth exploring. Probably better with like a single spell that does 5 or more damage type thing than it is actually in this deck. But it's relatively on theme, right? And so one of the issues that might happen with this deck is running out of spells. We're not having actually enough burn to deal enough damage to your opponent's life total. And that's where things like the Phoenix that you're bringing back as a recurring threat, or maybe the Heart Flame Duelist could give you some more lifelink off of all of your burn damage to be able to stabilize against early pressure. The upside to this is that you do have a lot of interaction that can target your opponent's like mono red deck or Rakdos aggro deck, and so I think it could play well in the meta. And Virtue of Courage is a tempting one because then whenever a spell, you get the additional dig. And so the Case of the Crimson Pulse and the Virtue of Courage and the Artist's Talent are all considerations if the deck needs a little bit of refueling to be able to actually hit into enough resources to win the game. So the whole point of me sharing this is obviously just to spark ideas. So if you have any ideas of what, where you would like to take the archetype, let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear back from you. And if you happen to run this deck or something close to it, always curious to see how how these things are doing for other people as well. Next one that I want to talk about is Izzet Pirates, and Izzet Pirates was close to being a good archetype in Lost Caverns of Ixalan, and I think it kind of missed the mark a little bit, and we have a lot of new tools coming in. So we got a couple of 1-drops here in the Spectral Sailors. We also have the Fanatical Firebrand. So we could go for a really low to the ground, lots of 1-drops, even like the Goblin Tomb Raider. So we could have like 16 1-drops in this deck. And we do have the Voltage Surge, which helps up against the early aggression of like mono red. It is lacking a little bit in interaction. And so I went with the Witchstalker Frenzy for kind of more of a mid-rangey removal card, and then also the Kite Sail Larcenist, which might be too slow. So if this turns out to be a little bit too slow and it's a little too mid-rangey feeling for the current meta, then we could drop in a bunch of 1-drops and lower the curve substantially. Also, you could go in the opposite direction, which is if the deck is kind of falling short and not having enough gas to actually complete, we could kind of go up the curve and bring in the Roaming Thrones, which have worked well in the past, giving the double triggers to everything, but does struggle if the meta is too fast paced. So we also got the Corsair Captain with the Pirate Lord, which could help the 1-drops kind of not become irrelevant later in the game. So I might be undervaluing how good just having a whole bunch of 1-drops is going to be in this archetype. And I threw one Malcolm in here. I'm not 100% sure if we should just be like, maybe it's better to just run a 4th Breaches. This one helps more against the control matchups, and when you're trying to really lean into that, like outvaluing your opponent. Staunch Crewmate gives you good dig, helps you find additional pirates to play. The Captain Storm works whenever an artifact enters, which works for like Corsair Captain, Spyglass Siren, etc. Also, those artifacts and treasure tokens can be good fodder for the Voltage Surge, which would help remove things like the Slasher and Mono Black. And there's a fair amount of flyers, right? So you've got the 1/1s, the Spyglass Sirens, the Kitesail Larcenists, Malcolm the Eyes, all of these that can be pushing a lot of evasive damage in the air. And then Breaches, if you have a whole bunch of pirates into play, triggers all 3 of these, creating even more treasure, more dig, and has been a really powerful card, which is why I'm wondering, of the legendaries, I think Breaches would be the one I'd bump up to 4 and maybe ditch the Malcolm. But I do think that Pirates is at least going to be explored in Foundations, and I hope it's going to be a viable archetype, because we also have the Secluded Courtyard. They decided to bring this one back in Foundations, and so that will be helpful as well. My third brew here is Mono Green Stompy, and the only new card that I'm throwing in here is Llanowar Elves. Everything else is kind of... I really wish we had 4 other 1-drop mana dorks, which would be too much to ask because that's how powerful Llanowar Elves is. But if we could like more reliably skip turn 2 and go like turn 1 mana dork, turn 3, I think there's some really good turn 3 threats in mono green, like Polychronos, the Scrap Shooter, Hauntwood Shrieker. They're all much more impressive if you're getting them out on turn 2, where then your opponent has less of a good option to remove or to respond to your play, outside of something like Go for the Throat. Now, I think this one's a little bit poorly positioned for the meta because you don't have instant speed interaction for mono red, so you're disrupting like the Slickshot Show Off and Rakdos aggro is pretty limited in this archetype. And I'm a little bit worried about the Day of Judgment, the four-costed Wrath that we got in Foundations. Could be problematic for this deck as well. But a turn 1 Llanowar Elves into a turn 2 Overlord of the Hauntwoods is going to find a place somewhere, and maybe even in just Domain. But I think that just strictly mono green, I think, has been kind of lacking from the meta, and so it would be nice if we could kind of get a more majority green deck that wasn't Domain to shine in the meta. So a couple of thoughts for this one would also be that a lot of them kind of benefit off of having trample, like Death Touch goes really nicely with trample, and a lot of the big bodies also just don't have trample. So there's a couple of different ways that we could go about giving them trample. One is the Hunter's Talent. Whenever you attack, target attacking creature gets +1/+0 and gains trample until end of turn. Also works as removal. Aloe Alchemist gives +3/+2 in trample. Could be an interesting one to explore. And then Innkeeper's Talent, I think, is one that at least deserves a potential, like at least it should be tested, just because of it being able to run away with the deck. Now, this is less of a counters build. I do think there's a green-white or green counters build that leans more heavily into like the Paw Patch Recruit and the Gold Vein Hydra, and I'll probably, I might play around with building that one as well. But right now, this is kind of like, I want this to get kind of some exploration first. And the good news with all this green beef is that our Evolving Adaptive is going to be really good. And this is kind of one of the cards that would also go into the counter deck. Tyver's Stand is a way to kind of prevent our green beef from getting killed by the Go for the Throats. And, we're likely to hit into a really good Manifest Dread target. And then the Keen-Eyed Curator, Graveyard Hate is definitely there's more graveyard hate in Foundations now, which is going to hurt the next archetype that I'm going to talk about, which is the Reanimator strategy. All right, and here's the fourth one, and this one's probably the most rough because it has a whole bunch of mythics that I haven't gotten to play with yet, and has the potential to be probably like too much leaning into one strategy, right? So we have the Zombify, which we got in Foundations, along with the Rite of the Moth that we got in Duskmourn, as well as Valgavoth's Faithful. So we have 12 different ways of reanimating. And then as far as filling the graveyard goes, we have the Split Skin Doll, the Scrapwork Mutt, so that if we have the card in our hand, we can just discard it to the graveyard. And then Overlord of the Balemerc, which also helps us mill and get those cards into the graveyard. And then I think that there's a possibility that this is better suited for Dimir than it is actually Orzhov, but some form of self-mill strategy where you're trying to use scavengers to pick up the Sire of Seven Deaths. I think a lot of people are going to be exploring that pretty intuitive synergy. So it's maybe leaning a little bit too heavily into the Sire of the Seven Deaths, but this card seems ridiculously powerful, especially if we can cheat it out on turn 4. So that's kind of the quest for this deck. Pretty straightforward, nothing super to talk about here. Liliana of the Veil, being each player discards a card, is another one that I've seen in Reanimator strategies that could fit well into this archetype. Since you are discarding as well, is a good way to get the Reanimator targets into your graveyard. Beseech the Mirror, I've seen people exploring this as a way to tutor up for... it would basically allow you to run a lower amount of Reanimator spells so that you can then tutor off of one of your targets and bring it back. And then the classic Go for the Throat and Cut Down. I'm not sure that this deck actually needs these. I guess if you're going for a turn 4 Valgavoth, if you're getting up against a mono red deck where they're winning on turn 3, like Rakdos Prowess, then you might need to bring in the Go for the Throats or the Cut Downs to be able to survive that so that you win the game once they have the Valgavoth and can't answer the lifelink. Because one of the problems with this situation right now is Screaming Nemesis. If Screaming Nemesis gets shot by a shock, then you can't gain life, and the lifelink doesn't really help stabilize you. So, but outside of that, so you would need something like Go for the Throat to kill the Screaming Nemesis before they could shoot it with a shock. So this might be a necessary card that needs to come in, potentially over the Scavengers, or maybe 12 Reanimator spells is too much, because if you have a handful of Reanimator and nothing to reanimate, you're in a pretty bad spot. But I know that there's something here. I've seen this deck performing well with the Atraxa instead of the Sire of Seven Deaths, and is pretty close to this build. So there's definitely something there, and I'm excited to see what comes from it. So again, all of this is just for your benefit, for helping you come up with cool ideas for your own brews. I'm sure everybody's having a fun time creating their own decks with Foundations, and this is by no means a play-tested brew. So once again, I will warn you, craft with care. Early on in the format is definitely not great unless you have wild cards to spare. So with that, enjoy Foundations. Let me know what you think about the brews, and I'll be back on Monday to talk about the top performing decks in Best of 1 and Best of 3 with the new cards in Foundations. Always look forward to the very first week. It's probably the most exciting episode of that series. And then I'll probably showcase some form of top performing deck once we get some more data here in the next couple of days. So, of course, schedule willing. So take care, everybody, and I'll catch you all later.